Let's rewind to the early 80s, a time when General Motors seemed to be stuck in a midlife crisis. Their cars were shrinking, their designs were blending into one anonymous blob, and the build quality? Let's just say it was more discount blender than precision machine. Meanwhile, the Japanese were showing up like overachieving neighbors with perfectly mowed lawns and fuel-efficient sedans. Enter Bob Burger, not the cartoon character, but Cadillac's top dog at the time. He looked around and realized Cadillac needed a comeback kid. Not just another sedan, he wanted a two-seater knockout. Something sleek, stylish, futuristic, and yes, eye-wateringly expensive. The result? I know what you're thinking. What's this, some AI voice reading robot-made content? Yeah, the voice is AI, but the rest? Every line, every shot, every detail is the result of hours of research, writing, editing, and design. So before you scroll past thinking it's all machine-made, just know, a real human built this thing from the ground up. The result? The Alente. A car that promised the stars but only reached the upper atmosphere. Still, it was Cadillac swinging for the fences. And that's what makes it fascinating. So, in 1982, Burger sent a hand-picked team of engineers on a James Bond-style mission to Italy. Their goal? Find the perfect design partner to give Cadillac some much-needed European flair. After sniffing around the Italian elite, they came back with one name: Pininfarina. Yep, the same studio dressing up Ferraris like they're going to a black-tie gala. But not everyone was popping champagne. Back in Detroit, Cadillac's in-house designers felt like they'd just been ghosted. Studio boss Wayne Cady wasn't thrilled. After years of loyal work on Cadillac's bread-and-butter models, he felt tossed aside the moment something fun came along. By 1983, the deal was sealed. Pininfarina was on board, despite being knee-deep in Testarossas and Mondials. By 1986, they even built a dedicated facility 20 miles outside Turin, just for the Alente. The bodies were built and painted in Turin, then shipped to the new plant in San Giorgio, where the magic happened. Trim, tech, leather, the works. And just when you think the story couldn't get any more over the top, Cadillac built a 7,000-mile-long assembly line. Literally. Here's how it worked. Brand new Alente bodies, fresh from Pininfarina's paint line, were loaded into custom-built aluminum containers. Think first-class shipping crates. From there, they were trucked to the Turin airport and loaded, 56 at a time, onto specially equipped 747s flown by Alitalia and Lufthansa. Destination? Detroit. These transatlantic cargo runs happened 3 times a week. And on the way back, those same jets carried American-made parts, underbodies, rear sections, electrical guts, back to Italy. Like a reverse souvenir system. As Bill Bushman, head of Alente production, famously put it, the longest assembly line in the world. Imagine spending 5 years in a long-term, long-distance relationship with a car. That was Dave Hill's life. One of GM's most obsessive minds and the future father of the C5 Corvette, Hill spent month after month flying to Italy, tweaking, testing, fine-tuning a machine he couldn't stop thinking about. This wasn't just another project. It was Cadillac's moonshot dressed in leather and steel. For a front-wheel drive machine, it danced with surprising grace. Hill knew it. And early on, its 4.1-liter V8 had enough bite to square off with Mercedes' 3.8. But when the Germans turned up the heat with a 4.5, Cadillac found itself sprinting uphill. Then came March 1987. Cadillac didn't just unveil a car, it unveiled a statement piece. Underneath it wore Corvette DNA, independent suspension up front, a composite transverse leaf spring in the rear. Brakes? 4 discs backed by Bosch ABS. Steering? Rack and pinion, power-assisted, razor-sharp for its time. And the gearbox? An electronically tuned 4-speed with a viscous clutch that shifted like it had something to prove. Smooth under pressure, but ready to snap to attention the moment you asked for more. The car rode on 15-inch forged aluminum wheels wrapped in Goodyear Eagle VR performance tires. Inside, it offered multi-way adjustable Recaro leather seats, digital instrumentation, and a premium Delco Bose sound system that made the cabin feel more like a studio than a car. Most Cadillacs at the time were gliding off dealer lots for under $30,000. But the Alante? That one walked in wearing a tuxedo and dropped a price tag of $54,700. And that was just the entry fee. For that kind of money, you got a removable aluminum hardtop, a high-end warranty that stretched to 7 years or 100,000 miles, and the feeling that you were stepping into something a little more exclusive than the usual American luxury coupe. Cadillac didn't build this car to sell by the tens of thousands. The target? 6,000 to 8,000 units a year. Enough to carve out a solid chunk of the US luxury roadster market. But this wasn't just about sales. It was about perception, prestige. GM's own Alex Mayer called the Alante a very special car. Not just because of what it was, but because of who helped make it. There was a real sense of electricity around the project. Pininfarina brought the curves and craftsmanship. Cadillac brought the muscle and the math. Cadillac wasn't looking for customers. They were hunting for icons, people whose mere presence made others take notice. The Alante wasn't built for the masses. It was designed for the spotlight. When John Grettenberger stepped into leadership in '84, the mission sharpened. This car needed to speak to power. And to seal that message, they didn't rely on a press release. They brought in the man behind the metal, Sergio Pininfarina. He didn't walk out like a corporate guest. He arrived like a maestro, stepping onto the stage in front of Cadillac's top 100 master dealers. No hype, no theatrics, just presence. And in that quiet confidence, he told them what this machine meant. When it came time to show the Alante to Cadillac's top dealers, they didn't just roll it out on a platform, they flew in Sergio Pininfarina. The man behind the design didn't bother with big theatrics. He stood in front of a room full of seasoned sales veterans and spoke plainly about the car, the process, and the idea of building something that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the world's best. And when the cover came off, everything changed. There it was, low, sculpted, and unmistakably different. Not flashy, not loud, just confident. One by one, the dealers stepped up. They didn't need convincing, they needed a closer look. Hands on the fenders, eyes on the interior. No one said a word at first. Then the reaction hit, all at once. The room lit up with applause, real, unrehearsed, full-throttle approval. That moment didn't just sell the car, it reminded Cadillac people why they were Cadillac people in the first place. The Alante hit the press with confidence, and the press, surprisingly, didn't flinch. Sure, it carried a steep price tag, and Cadillac had set an eyebrow-raising sales target. But even in a luxury market where fewer than 4,000 Jaguar XJSs and barely 2,600 Porsche 928s sold the year before, the Alante made noise. The media took notice. Automobile Magazine didn't just praise it, they marked it as a turning point. A significant event, probably a milestone, in modern American automotive history. For all its beauty, the Alante didn't exactly launch as a flawless flagship. Underneath the sleek lines and Italian flair, there were cracks in the armor. Acceleration was underwhelming, taking a full 10 seconds to hit 60. The digital dash felt more arcade than automotive. Seats were firm enough to make short drives feel long, and the soft top, manual and stubborn, wasn't winning any fans. Build quality early on left something to be desired, but that didn't last. According to Bill Bushman, who oversaw manufacturing, the team in San Giorgio was something else entirely. Young, highly skilled, and driven, they brought a kind of precision that surprised even Detroit veterans. He recalled the factory being spotless, so clean it rivaled GM's medical facilities. And while they had to catch up to GM's strict dimensional standards, the collaboration ran deep. Sergio Pininfarina and his crew didn't flinch. They adapted, improved, and kept pushing. Eventually, the Alante didn't just look the part. It earned its way to the top of GM's quality charts. What began with hiccups evolved into something Cadillac could genuinely be proud of. The Alante didn't stand still. Year after year, it kept evolving, quietly sharpening its edges, refining its identity. In 1988, it gained a few luxuries that made life easier and more elegant. The soft top got a power pull-down. No more wrestling with canvas. Analog gauges returned as a no-cost option for those tired of glowing pixels. Headrests were reworked, just enough to silence the complaints. By 1989, Cadillac brought the heat. A new 4.5-liter V8 boosted output to 200 horsepower, dropping the 0 to 60 time below 8.5 seconds. Larger 16-inch wheels gave it more grip, and the ride got smarter thanks to a 3-mode adaptive suspension. The power steering? Now variable assist. The interior? Softer seats, better materials, more polish where it mattered. In 1990, Cadillac leaned into technology. The coupe was gone, soft top only from here on out. But it came with the world's first traction control system on a front-wheel drive car. That year also brought chassis tweaks, a standard CD player, and Cadillac's first driver-side airbag. And in 1991, it kept dialing things in. An improved convertible top, tighter suspension tuning, and the new Delco Bose Gold Series Symphony system that turned the cabin into a concert hall on wheels. Then came 1992. No headlines, no big updates. Just the calm before a Northstar-powered storm. And just like that, 1 year before its planned overhaul, Cadillac fired its final shot. The 1993 Allante rolled out with a beast under the hood. The all-new 4.6-liter Northstar 5.8, packing 290 horsepower and 290 pound-feet of torque. A 32-valve, dual overhead cam masterpiece, finally giving this car the lungs to match its looks. It launched through a new 4-speed auto and cut the 0 to 60 sprint down to under 7 seconds. No more hesitation. This thing moved. But it wasn't just about power. Cadillac revamped the rear with a short, long-arm suspension setup, dropped in next-gen traction control, and refined both road-sensing suspension and speed-sensitive steering. It was everything the Allante was supposed to be: fast, refined, and finally world-class. But it came 6 years too late. 1993 would be its final curtain call. A full redesign was already mapped out. New styling, a fully automatic top, and cutting-edge tech waiting in the wings. But the numbers didn't lie. Pouring $300 to $500 million into a low-volume roadster just didn't add up. For Cadillac leadership, it might have been the smart call, but it wasn't an easy one. Inside the company, there was real frustration. After all the progress, after all that potential, the Allante was just starting to hit its stride. The end hit hard, especially in Italy. Bill Bushman, who had led the Allante's production efforts, remembered the day he had to break the news to the San Giorgio team. These were the people who had poured their hearts into every car. And when he told them it was over, many of them cried. It wasn't just a job. For them, it was pride, identity, purpose. And just like that, it was gone. In the end, Cadillac built a total of 21,106 Allantes over 7 model years. Production began in 1987 with 3,003 units, followed by 2,569 in 1988, 3,298 in 1989, 3,101 in 1990, 2,500 in 1991, and 1,964 in 1992. The final year, 1993, saw a surge to 4,671 units. The very last Allante rolled off the line at the Detroit Hamtramck plant on July 16, 1993. That was the final chapter